I remember it like it was yesterday. The heat of the sun burning my skin, the smell of dry earth, and the soft sound of the sheep in the distance. I was just a young shepherd, tending to my flock in the quiet fields of Bethlehem. But no matter how simple everything seemed, something inside me always knew that I wasn't just any shepherd. There was something greater guiding me, something that my brothers could never perceive. As I carefully led the sheep, I felt a deep connection with them. It wasn't just skill. It was as if God was with me in every move, in every decision. And in those silent moments when the world seemed to stop, I talked to him. Not in words that others could understand, but in thoughts, in a silent faith that grew within me. I wasn't afraid when a lion or a bear appeared. Of course, the danger was real, but something told me I would be protected. Can you imagine? Facing a wild beast with nothing but a sling and unshakable faith? Each battle was a test, preparing me for something bigger that I couldn't yet comprehend. But somehow I knew those solitary moments in the hills were shaping me. My brothers? They saw me as just the youngest, a shepherd boy. But I saw something more. I felt that God had a plan for me, even if no one else could see it. And you? Have you ever felt like you were being prepared for something bigger, even when everything seems ordinary and routine? How many times do we face our own lions without realizing we're being forged for something yet to come? I knew I was destined for something beyond protecting the flock, and this was only the first part of my story. I was in the fields as usual, guiding the sheep. It was a hot day like so many others, and the work seemed endless. But there was peace in that solitude, a sense that despite the routine, something greater was always near. Then suddenly one of my father's servants came running. His expression was urgent, something rare. "David, your father is calling you. The prophet Samuel is here." My first reaction was surprise. Why me? Samuel, the prophet known throughout Israel, a man of God, was at my house. What could he possibly want with me, the youngest, the one who was always left out of the family's major decisions? But without question, I began walking towards our house, feeling my heart beat faster with each step. As I walked, my mind raced. Surely all my brothers had already passed before Samuel. They were grown men, soldiers, warriors ready for any battle. I, on the other hand, was still seen as the shepherd, the one tending the flocks, far from responsibilities in the eyes of others. I knew my place in the family, or at least I thought I did. I arrived, and as I entered, the atmosphere was heavy, thick with a sense of expectation. All my brothers were there watching me. The prophet Samuel stood, his piercing eyes observing me with an intensity I had never experienced before. In that moment, everything stopped. I could feel the sweat drying on my face, the earth still clinging to my hands, and I wondered what I could possibly be doing there in that situation. Then, without giving me time to fully understand, Samuel stepped forward. His eyes gleamed as if he already knew what needed to be done. He raised the oil and, with an impressive solemnity, anointed my head. I felt the oil trickling down my hair, a sensation that was both physical and deeply spiritual. Time seemed to slow down, and amidst it all I heard Samuel say, "This is God's chosen one." Those words echoed like thunder inside me. Me? Chosen? I, who had barely been noticed by my own brothers, was now being singled out by God? My mind couldn't quite grasp the magnitude of what was happening, but deep down, something in me knew. It was as if all those solitary hours in the fields, all the quiet conversations with God, all the battles against lions and bears had led me to this moment. Can you imagine what it's like to be chosen for something you never even knew was possible? To be called to a destiny that seems so vast, so far from your reality. That day changed everything. And it was there, in that simple moment, that God's true plan for me began to unfold. But I knew this was just the beginning. What lay ahead would be greater than I could have ever imagined. The battlefield was thick with tension. On one side, the Israelite army paralyzed by fear. On the other, the Philistines, with a giant warrior standing at the front, daring any man to face him. Goliath was a terrifying sight. Over 2 meters tall, his armor glistened under the sun, heavy and imposing. His voice echoed through the valley, taunting the Israelites, and his words struck the soldiers like blows to their hearts. I arrived there by chance. My father had sent me to bring food to my brothers who were fighting on the battlefield. Little did I know that this day would become a turning point in my life and the destiny of the entire nation of Israel. When I heard Goliath's taunts, something inside me ignited. How could he dare to challenge the army of the living God, and how could everyone just stand there and accept it? How could no one rise up against him? It was at that moment that I made my decision. I was just a young shepherd with no military training and none of the experience the other soldiers had. But I had something they didn't, an unshakable faith that God was with me. When I approached King Saul and told him I would fight Goliath, he looked at me with disbelief. "You can't fight him, you're just a boy, and he's been a warrior since his youth." But I insisted. When I was tending my father's sheep, I faced lions and bears. The same God who saved me from them will save me from this giant. Saul, perhaps out of a lack of other options, allowed me to go. He tried to dress me in his own armor, but it was too heavy, too uncomfortable. I knew that wasn't what would bring me victory. I took only my sling and 5 smooth stones from the stream. That was all I needed. As I walked toward Goliath, I felt the weight of every eye on me. But my focus was elsewhere, not on the giant, not on his threats, but on God, who had been with me from the very beginning. Goliath mocked me, laughing at my appearance, at my youth. "You come at me with sticks and stones?" he shouted, full of contempt. But I knew this battle wasn't mine. "You come against me with sword, spear, and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord of hosts," I shouted back. In that moment, everything seemed to slow down. I took a stone, placed it in my sling, and swung it through the air. With one quick, precise motion, the stone flew through the air and struck Goliath on the forehead. The giant fell to the ground, lifeless. The silence that followed was deafening. The impossible had happened. I, a simple shepherd, had defeated the greatest warrior of the Philistines, not with physical strength, but with faith. And it was that faith that changed the destiny of Israel on that day. After the victory over Goliath, my life took an unexpected turn. I was brought to King Saul's court, where the environment at first seemed to be one of great honor. The king welcomed me, and with a humble heart, I accepted my new role. My fame grew among the people, and Saul seemed pleased to have me by his side. But it was there, at the heart of the court, that I began to realize that not everything was as simple as it seemed. There was something dark in Saul's eyes, something that began to grow stronger with each passing day. I was just a young man, but I could already feel the weight of the emotions stirring within the king. He was consumed by an unease, a restlessness that I could barely understand. That's when the music came into play. With my lyre in hand, I would sit at Saul's feet and play. The soft, soothing notes filled the room, as if each melody could reach the depths of his soul. Gradually, Saul's face would relax, his tensions would fade, and the darkness surrounding him seemed to lift, if only for a brief moment. It was as though the music had the power to calm the king, to bring him peace in the midst of the storm raging in his mind. But that peace never lasted long. Though I was young and respectful, the truth began to reveal itself. Saul no longer saw me as an ally, but as a threat. The more I served the king, the more I felt his jealousy grow. The people started talking more about me than about him, and Saul, who once saw me as a trusted young shepherd, now viewed me as a rival. The same hand that had held a spear to defend Israel was now beginning to turn against me. Soon I realized that Saul's court, with all its splendor and glory, was also a dangerous place. A place where shadows grew, where music, no matter how beautiful, could not fully silence the jealousy and fear. My relationship with the king was becoming more complex by the day, and I knew that soon the peace that the music brought wouldn't be enough to contain the storm that was brewing. My popularity continued to grow. The people sang my name in the streets, and this made Saul's jealousy turn into something deadly. The king, who had once seen me as an ally, now saw in me the embodiment of his own downfall. The resentment grew to the point where Saul tried to kill me. On several occasions, his spear came dangerously close to me, but somehow, God delivered me every time. I knew my life was in danger, and I had to make a difficult decision: to flee. I left behind the comfort of the court and became a fugitive, hiding in caves and deserts, always one step ahead of Saul's men. The nights were cold, and the days were endless. The shadow of pursuit loomed over me constantly. I knew Saul would not rest until I was dead, but even in my flight, I wasn't alone. Gradually, men began to gather around me, men who, like me, were dissatisfied, exiled, or simply searching for something greater. They became my followers, loyal warriors who believed in my destiny. Despite the hardships, I could feel God's protection with every step we took. There were moments when I had the opportunity to end the chase once and for all. Once, while Saul was sleeping in the very cave where my men and I were hiding, one of my soldiers urged me to take the chance. "The Lord has delivered your enemy into your hands," he whispered. But I knew that killing the Lord's anointed was not the answer. So instead I cut off a piece of Saul's cloak, proving that I could have taken his life but chose to spare him. When I showed Saul the piece of his cloak, he wept. For a brief moment it seemed like everything was resolved, that he had realized his mistake, and that I was not his enemy. But unfortunately that peace was fleeting. Saul's jealousy always returned, stronger each time, and the pursuit continued. Have you ever felt like you were being chased by something or someone, even when all you wanted was peace? Those days were marked by uncertainty and constant fleeing, but through it all, I was reminded that even with so many against me, God was always by my side. He was my fortress in the midst of the storm. The death of Saul brought a heavy silence over Israel. It was a time of mourning, but also of uncertainty. The king was dead, and with him, the fragile balance between the tribes of Israel and Judah. I, who had been pursued for so long, now stood before a new reality. The path to the throne was opening, but not without challenges. The tribes were divided. Judah, my own people, welcomed me as their king, but Israel, still loyal to Saul's lineage, hesitated. For years I fought to unify the kingdom, not through brute force, but with wisdom, patience, and faith. I knew that Israel's destiny was not to remain divided, and every decision I made was guided by the purpose God had placed in my heart. But ascending to the throne wasn't just about external victories. I knew that to rule a people, the first kingdom I needed to conquer was my own heart. Every step I took as king required more than military strategy. It demanded humility before God and a heart constantly attentive to His guidance. There were wars to be fought, yes, but there were also moments of deep reflection when I realized my greatest enemy could be the pride or vanity that comes with power. When I finally managed to unite Israel and Judah under a single government, I felt the weight of the kingdom on my shoulders. It was as if I were carrying the responsibility of an entire nation that had long sought stability and peace. The promise God made to me, back when I was just a simple shepherd, was now being fulfilled before my eyes. Israel prospered, and the kingdom grew stronger, serving as a testament to God's power and faithfulness. Have you ever thought about how the greatest challenges in life are not just the visible battles, but the ones we fight within ourselves? The throne I had finally reached wasn't the end, but the beginning of a reign marked by the constant pursuit of following God's purpose, of remaining faithful to a calling that was bigger than myself. With the kingdom now united, I felt the weight of the crown like never before. Every decision I made affected the lives of thousands. Israel was flourishing, and God blessed each step we took. Jerusalem was established as the capital, the city that would become the heart of our nation. I brought the Ark of the Covenant there, symbolizing that God was at the center of everything we did. However, the life of a king is never free from trials. Even amidst prosperity, I knew that every victory demanded even more responsibility and humility before God. Looking back, I could see how God's hand had always been upon me, from my days as a shepherd to the great challenges on the throne. Every victory, every battle, every moment of hiding in caves, It all had been part of a greater plan. Still, even with the kingdom strong and prosperous, I faced moments of weakness. And it's in those moments that we are reminded, no matter how elevated our destinies may seem, that we are all human. But above all, I always knew the kingdom wasn't mine. It belonged to God. He had promised me a strong kingdom, and I clung to that promise, even when the shadows of my own failures seemed to close in around me. Ah, Bathsheba. Even at the height of my reign, with so many blessings and victories, it was in that moment that my humanity and my flaws were tragically revealed. It all started on an ordinary day, one that for me seemed like any other. The Israelite army was at war, but for some reason I stayed behind in Jerusalem. And it was there, from the terrace of the palace, that I saw her for the first time. Bathsheba, so beautiful, bathing in the open air. In that moment, something in me faltered. I was the king, accustomed to leading armies, making tough decisions, and ruling with wisdom. But in the face of that vision, I was overcome with an uncontrollable desire. I sent messengers to bring her to me. And even knowing she was the wife of Uriah, one of my most loyal warriors, I couldn't resist the temptation. What I did that day was wrong, and I knew it. But desire had blinded my reason. The situation worsened when Bathsheba sent word that she was pregnant. The weight of guilt began to fall upon me, and instead of confessing my sins, I tried to cover them up. I called Uriah back from the battlefield, hoping he would go home, spend time with his wife, and that everyone would believe the child was his. But Uriah, in his loyalty and honor, refused to go home while his fellow soldiers remained on the battlefield. Desperate, I made the darkest decision of my life. I sent Uriah back to the battlefield, but this time with secret instructions to have him placed on the front lines, where he would surely be killed. And so it happened. Uriah, a man of such integrity, died because of my sin. When it all seemed resolved, I took Bathsheba as my wife, and for a while I believed my actions would remain hidden. But God sees everything, and he sent the prophet Nathan to confront me. Nathan told a story about a rich man who stole the only lamb of a poor man, even though he had everything he needed. Outraged by the injustice of the story, I declared that the rich man should be punished. That's when Nathan looked me in the eyes and said, "You are that man." In that moment, the weight of my sins fell upon me with full force. I repented deeply. I prayed, I wept, and I begged for God's forgiveness. But even with my repentance, the consequences of my actions were unavoidable. The child Bathsheba and I were expecting did not survive. The pain of that loss was immense, but I learned an eternal lesson about the consequences of following my own desires instead of God's ways. Even so, in his infinite mercy, God blessed us with another son, Solomon, who would become the next king of Israel, the wisest man who ever lived. And it was through this lineage, stained by my mistake, that God fulfilled his greatest promise, to bring the Savior into the world. Bathsheba's story is not just one of sin, but also of redemption. Even in the midst of my failure, God brought forth something magnificent. And have you ever reflected on how even our greatest failures can be used for a higher purpose when we repent and seek forgiveness? Tamar, my daughter. Her story is one of the darkest and most painful chapters of my life, something that makes me tremble with sorrow even to this day. Amidst all the conquests and victories that marked my journey as king, Tamar's suffering exposed the cracks that power and silence can bring, revealing that even within the palace, the greatest tragedies can be born from within one's own family. Tamar was beautiful, a young woman full of grace and virtue. She was the pride of our family, her kindness reflected in every gesture, every word. But a cruel fate took her by surprise, bringing pain and dishonor at the hands of her own brother Amnon. Consumed by a selfish and perverse desire, he did the unthinkable. He devised a sick plan, pretending to be ill, and in doing so, lured Tamar close. She came, unsuspecting, with the innocence she had always carried in her heart. When she realized she was trapped, Tamar pleaded. She tried to resist. Her words still echo in my mind. "No, brother, please don't do this. Don't dishonor me this way." But Amnon, blinded by his desire and the power he thought he held, violated her, destroying everything she represented. And afterward, in an even crueler act, he rejected her, casting her aside as if she were worthless. The shame she felt, the pain she carried for the rest of her life. As a father, I failed miserably. When I learned what had happened, my anger was deep. But what did I do? Nothing. I remained motionless, trapped in the paralysis of my own failures. The silence I maintained after the incident was, perhaps, one of the greatest mistakes of my life. I should have acted, protected Tamar, sought justice, but I didn't. And it was in that silence that the wounds began to fester even more. Tamar's brother, Absalom, couldn't bear what had happened to her. His love for his sister consumed him with a desire for revenge. For 2 years he harbored that hatred until finally he avenged Tamar by killing Amnon. It was an act of personal justice, but one that brought even more pain and destruction to our household. Just as I had failed to protect Tamar, I was also unable to stop the cycle of violence that was born within my own family. If before, the sin in my heart, taking Bathsheba and killing Uriah, had cast a shadow over my life, the tragedy of Tamar and Amnon was the final blow that revealed just how silently sin can corrode everything around us until the cracks become unbridgeable chasms. Bathsheba, Uriah, Amnon, Absalom, and Tamar. Each of them, in different ways, paid the price for my mistakes, for my silences. Thus, the kingdom that I had fought so hard to unify, the kingdom I built with God's blessing, also became the stage for tragedies that didn't arise from battles with external enemies, but from the failures within my own house. Tamar's story is, for me, the most painful reminder that no matter how powerful a king I may have been, I failed where it mattered most, in protecting those closest to me. And now, as I look back, I realize that just as it happened to me, life often places us before choices whose consequences echo for generations. What could I have done to avoid so much pain? How might the fate of my family and my kingdom have been different if I had listened to those silent pleas, if I had acted as a father and not merely as a king? This is the truth I carry with me. Even amidst power and greatness, it is often our silences that lead to the greatest tragedies. The plague. One of the darkest moments of my reign, when I felt the weight of my decisions fall upon the very people I had sworn to protect. It all began with a mistake that, in my arrogance, I committed. I wanted to count the number of men fit for war in Israel and Judah. I wanted to measure the power of my kingdom, to know the size of my army. But this census was not something God had commanded. It was driven by pride and the desire to control what should have been entrusted into his hands. Joab, the commander of my army, tried to warn me. A man of war, he knew all too well the dangers of arrogance. "Why does my Lord want to do this? Hasn't the Lord already given us victory? Why do you need to know the number of soldiers?" he asked me. But I insisted. And with the authority of my kingship, Joab was forced to carry out my order. When the census was completed, something terrible descended upon me. My heart filled with guilt, as if a shadow had fallen over me. I knew I had sinned, that I had defied God's will out of my pride. That's when the prophet Gad came to me with a clear message from God. Israel would suffer because of my transgression, and I had to choose the form of the punishment. 3 options were given to me: 7 years of famine, 3 months of fleeing from my enemies, or 3 days of plague upon the people. My heart was torn. What could I do? Each choice would bring pain, and I knew that the people who had done nothing wrong would pay the price for my error. In the end, I chose the plague. I knew that falling into God's hands, even in judgment, was better than falling into the hands of men. And so the plague came with devastating force. In just 3 days, 70,000 people died across Israel. Horror and sorrow spread throughout the land. Every life lost weighed on my shoulders like an unbearable burden. It was a pain I could never forget, a terrible lesson about the cost of arrogance and turning away from God's will. As the plague ravaged my people, I cried out to the Lord, I saw the angel of death approaching Jerusalem, ready to destroy the city, and in that moment, I threw myself to the ground in despair. "I am the one who has sinned," I cried. "I am the one who has done wrong. What have these sheep done? Let your hand fall upon me and upon my father's house." In his mercy, God heard my plea and commanded the angel to stop. The plague ceased. But the price had already been paid in many lives. To show my repentance, I built an altar to the Lord at the place where the plague stopped, at the threshing floor of Araunah, the Jebusite. There I offered sacrifices to the Lord, begging for forgiveness and mercy. It was then that I began gathering everything needed for the construction of the temple: vast amounts of gold, silver, bronze, wood, and precious stones. I enlisted skilled artisans and workers, seeking the best to ensure that the temple would be worthy to house the Ark of the Covenant and serve as the center of worship for Israel. Although I couldn't build it myself, I did everything in my power to ensure Solomon would have everything he needed to complete this sacred task. I gave him detailed instructions on how the temple should be built, all based on the guidance I had received from God. And even though the temple would be built by hands other than my own, I felt at peace knowing that God had chosen my son for this mission. Solomon, with his wisdom, was the right man to build a house of worship for God, a place where the people of Israel could seek the presence of the Lord. So yes, I was responsible for starting the preparations and envisioning the temple, but it was Solomon who brought it to completion. And when it was finally finished, Solomon's temple became the spiritual heart of our nation, a magnificent house where God's glory descended and filled the place. It became an eternal symbol of our covenant with the Lord. The plague taught me, in the most bitter way, how much my decisions impacted those who trusted me. It serves as a constant reminder that even in power, the heart must remain humble before God. As kings, leaders, or even in our personal lives, we must always remember that our actions have consequences. Pride, when it comes between us and God, can bring destruction, not only to ourselves but to everyone around us. In my final days, old age had caught up with me, and my body, tired from the weight of battles, decisions, and mistakes, felt its toll. I knew my time was coming to an end, and the future of the kingdom of Israel depended on a careful transition. God had chosen Solomon to succeed me, and knowing this, I prepared him as best I could, both in wisdom and resources, so that he could fulfill God's purpose. Before I died, I summoned Solomon, my son, and gave him one last piece of advice, words filled with the wisdom of a life full of highs and lows, victories and failures. "Be strong and courageous," I said. "Follow the ways of the Lord your God. Walk in his laws, his commandments, and do what is right in his eyes. For then you will prosper in all you do and wherever you go." Solomon would not only inherit the throne, but also the mission to build the temple I had long dreamed of. Beyond that, he would need to govern with wisdom and justice, guided by God's hand. The responsibility he carried was no small task. He had to unite, lead, and keep the people of Israel faithful to the Lord. And I knew that without God, neither strength, wealth, nor intelligence would keep him on the throne. My last words to Solomon were more than just fatherly advice. They were a deep appeal, a reminder that Israel's success and peace would depend on his faithfulness to God, not on military power or earthly wisdom. I knew from personal experience that if he strayed from the Lord, the kingdom would suffer the consequences. Solomon inherited not just a prosperous kingdom, but also the lessons of an entire lifetime. And now, it was his turn to rule, to build the temple, and to keep the nation faithful to God. The future of Israel rested in his hands. But how did Solomon face this challenge? Did he follow the ways of the Lord as I had advised him? In the next video, we'll dive into the story of Solomon, the wisest man who ever lived and the one who brought a new chapter to the kingdom of Israel. You'll see how he ruled, built the long-awaited temple, and made decisions that impacted history forever. If you want to learn more about Solomon's legacy, what he did with the kingdom he inherited, and the powerful lessons we can take from his life, don't miss the next video. And don't forget to like this video, share it with your friends, and subscribe to the channel to keep following these fascinating stories that shape the destiny of Israel and still have so much to teach us today. See you in the next video.